All right, so let's get started. This was one of the sessions where we didn't really have a topic scheduled, but based on some of the questions that have come in, I decided to maybe spend some more time on commands, and then I'm open for suggestions for what to talk about on Thursday. But so if you're first time here, my name is Brian Ekins, and I'm the designer for the Fusion 360 API. And so welcome to the session, and we'll dive in. So we spent a session earlier talking about what commands are in Fusion, and so just a really quick review, and then we'll get into some more details. But so this is the area, if you look at the object model chart, this is the section where all the command related, user interface related stuff is in this yellow box. And this section that's highlighted now, so that is the part that lets you create commands. So we'll look at that in more detail in a second. So these control definitions and or button, command definitions. So those define what a command looks like in the UI. Right, so it's not the behavior of the command, it's just defining how it will look in the UI. And it's not defining where it is in the UI either, just how it will look. So it has things like this, the name, the icon, the tooltip. And when the command actually gets executed by the user, then this command definition is what reacts to that execution. So say the command definition itself isn't directly visible in the UI, and we'll see that in a second. And what we have instead are these toolbar controls, and those define where the command is displayed. So, and here's that area of the object model. So we've got the structure that kind of defines the structure of the user interface, and then you position controls within that structure, and controls reference the command definition, and that's again where like the tooltip and the text, the name of the command is defined, and so the control just picks that up in the command definition. And so it's the control that's visible in the UI. And so here's an example of this dialog test. That's a custom command that I built, and is now displayed in here with the command. So what we're looking at is the control, and it's referencing my command, and that command has that little icon, and it has the name dialog test. And so I could actually have multiple controls referencing the same command. And then if I change anything about that command definition, the name or the tooltip or whatever, then that would be reflected in all of the controls because they're all referencing the same command definition. All right, so that structure of where I can put my controls. So what Fusion supports is we have it divided up into workspaces. So there's multiple workspaces, and so here are the ones currently that come with Fusion. And with each workspace, I'll get back to what's with each workspace, but we've got some toolbars that are independent of the workspaces. So you have this QAT, or Quick Access Toolbar. So it's just a set of commands in the upper left, and then there's another set of commands on the right-hand side. And they tend to be, like the ones on the left tend to be more file-related, the ones on the right more help and user settings commands. And then this nav toolbar, which tends to be window-oriented commands. And then we have panels, and for each workspace has a set of panels associated with it. And so when that workspace is active, those panels are displayed. And then so here's a specific panel, so the sketch panel. And a panel basically just consists of a list of controls, really. Remember, controls are referencing command definitions. And so now the user has access to those commands, and he can use that little arrow to say add to toolbar, and then that will pop that command up into the main toolbar, so he has easy access to it. And I'll wait a second for that to refresh for everybody. So you can, the user can add and remove commands from the top level toolbar by using that little up arrow, or if it's already been promoted to the top, you can, there's a little X, so you can remove it from the top. So the user has really control of what's seen in that top level and can easily customize it, so his frequently used commands are one click away. So command behavior. So this area now, this defines all of the API objects related around what happens when a command actually gets executed. So the command definition, like I say, is just the icon and the tooltip. So it's just how that kind of the button displays. The control is where that button will be displayed. And now when it gets clicked, there's an execute event, or a command created event that gets fired, and now we need to do something in reaction to that to get the behavior of the command that we want. So command created event's fired, and then you have some control over the dialog. So you can optionally, you don't have to have a dialog if your command doesn't really need any input from the user. It can just immediately do whatever it's going to do when it gets clicked. But if you want to, you can display a dialog, which most commands do, to get additional feedback from the user. And you have some control over that. And so you can build these custom dialogs using what we call command inputs to get information from the user. And you have some control. This is what I meant by that dialog look, over a little bit of control. So like maybe I want different buttons, and I'll show a demonstration of this. I want OK to say something else, or I only want cancel, or so I have a little bit of control over this, but not a lot. What I do have control over is what we call the command inputs, and those are in this little example: the selection, the evaluation type, and density. So those are three different inputs that this command is getting from the user, and so you can define those for each command, and so that's what I want to spend quite a bit of time going over. Right. So here's some things that you have control over for the dialog itself, and so you can say if the OK button is visible or not, and you can override the default text that would show up for the OK button. So if you wanted to change it to be yes instead of OK, right? And the cancel button text, you can change that too. So you could have a yes, no instead of cancel and OK. There's a property on the command called isRepeatable. And so if this is true, which is the default, then your command will show up in the context menu. You'll get this repeat whatever your command was. But if you set that to false, then it won't show up in that. So you have control over that. You have some control over the dialog size, although this we're working on this really to make it behave the way we want. Fusion has kind of an interesting concept of dialog sizes. Maybe this is worth just showing because it's maybe hard to visualize otherwise. So if I say start extrude, all right, so you can see the extrude dialog there. Notice where it is on the screen and its size. And now I go to say offset plane. See, it's in the same location, the same size. The height of the dialog changes a little bit depending on how many controls are there. Or we go to the joint command. Oh, I can't do that one. So press pull command. So any command that has a dialog is going to show up in that location at that size. So So by default, your commands are going to behave the same, and but we're wanting to give you a little more control over that. So maybe you just want your dialog to be a fixed size all the time, so that we're working on providing some more capabilities than Fusion does itself. And then there's some an events associated with a command. So there's activate, deactivate, destroy, and execute. And so the typical one that you maybe would only need to listen for is the execute. And the execute fires when the user clicks OK on the dialog, or if you don't show a dialog, it just fires immediately after the creation. And the execute is where you do really whatever the final results of your command, whatever that your command does, that's where you do the actual work. And the other events are kind of more optional. So the activate, that'll fire when your command is first created, so it's when it's activated. And then, but your command can be deactivated, and so it hasn't stopped. It's still alive, but it's not the active command. And this can happen because there's some commands in Fusion that don't kill the current command. That's the typical behavior, is when you run one command, it kills the previous command. But there are some commands that don't kill the previous command, they just kind of stack on top of it temporarily. And then when you quit that command, it goes back to the previous command. And these are typically window kind of commands. So I want to zoom in and out or scroll. And so they just temporarily take over. And so you would get a deactivate event. And then when that command terminates, then you would get an activate when your command is reactivated. And so if you care about that, then there are these events you can listen to. And then destroy gets called at the end when your command is completely terminated. And so if you need to do some cleanup work in that, you can do that. And there's another event called the execute preview. And this is fired by Fusion to you to tell you draw whatever preview graphics you want for this command. And so you can do any kind of standard creation. You could draw a sketch and extrude that, and whatever a lot of times for the preview you'll do what the final result is. So you may have a function that creates the final result, and you call that same function in the execute and in the execute preview. And when you call the execute preview, or when that event fires to you, you create whatever the result is, and then when the user makes changes in the dialog, Inventor will abort all of those changes and then call execute preview again so you can recreate it. And that happens automatically, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up anything. It just, every time execute preview calls, you just draw whatever you need, and then Fusion takes care of all the management of that. And the same with the execute, is you just draw whatever, and then that gets all contained into a single transaction, which we'll talk about a little more in a few minutes. So we have the execute preview. There's an input changed, so that's as the user is making changes in the dialog. He's typing in, a length or whatever. Then you get notified on each of those changes, and because maybe in some cases they picked a drop down to pick a different option, and so now you wanted to change the visibility of other inputs in the dialog. You want to show some and hide some others, and so this notifies you when something has changed like that. And then validate inputs is that gives you a chance to look at all of the inputs in the dialog and check to see if the user has supplied all of the required inputs or not, and then you can say yes or no to that. And if you say no, then the OK button is automatically disabled, and And I think execute preview probably isn't fired yet either, because you don't have the needed inputs to show the preview. But not sure on that one. It might still fire, but I don't think so. But anyway, and validate inputs. So it controls whether the OK is enabled or not. And then finally, there's a selection event, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So all command inputs. So what happens? So the command created event fires, and you get that, and now you create all the command inputs that you need that are the inputs that you need to get from the user for your command. And so these are all different classes that you create new objects of these types. And what I want to talk about here is the common functionality that every command input has. So all of these support this. They all have a tooltip. And so when you define that, so it shows up like that if you have just a tooltip. And then if you hover for a minute, then this tooltip description will show up. So it's just a longer text if you want to have that. So it's optional. The tooltip is optional, and the tooltip description is optional. And you can also have a tool clip. And so the tooltip description and the tool clip will show up at the same time. So they're delayed a little bit from the tooltip. And the tool clip is just an image of whatever you want. And there's also an is enabled property, so that just tells you, sets if the user can interact with that input or not. So maybe you want to disable it until some other inputs are provided, and then now that one's valid. And there's is visible. So typically you would create all of your command inputs on the command created, but you might make some of them invisible. And then as other settings change on the dialog, you would turn on and off inputs and to change the content. And you can see that in some of the inventor commands. So like in extrude, depending on what type of extent I want, if I'm just extruding a certain distance, or if I'm extruding up to a plane, so when I choose what type of distance I wanted to do, other inputs on the dialog will change to collect the required input. There's a property called is full width, and so this shows with it false, which is the default. So if is full width is false, then I see the name of this command input, which this one is text input, and then the input part. But if I have full width, then the name isn't displayed, and the input part of the object of the control goes the full width of the dialog. All right. So let me go into each one of the command inputs that are currently supported, and we're adding more types with each release. So there's a command input called a string command input, and it's for getting just simple string values. And it's a single line of unformatted text. So here's an example of where Inventor uses, or Fusion uses this, is in the creating text in a sketch. And so this, it's unformatted. It's just getting whatever the user types in. And there's no validation of the input that Fusion's doing automatically. You can react to that on validation event that's fired, and maybe you're looking for a certain kind of text in there, and so you could validate it yourself, but Fusion isn't doing any validation. So whatever the user enters is okay with Fusion. There's a property on the string value command input called isPassword, and if you set that to true, then characters don't show up, just dots. show up. If you read the value, you get the actual value, but the user just sees those dots. And to get more complex strings, so there's another kind of input called text box command input, and this supports multiple lines. And here too, there's no automatic validation. Whatever's there, Fusion's fine with it. You'd have to do your own validation if you have some requirements in that way. You can set these so they're editable or not. Right, so this top one that I'm showing here is editable. You can see very faintly a box around it. We're wanting to have them change that so the background is more visible and it's more obvious that it's an entry field. And you can also use these to display some simple HTML. And so that's what this little example is showing. So here I'm using some formatting to bold notice, and then using an A-link to have actually a link to some HTML, to a URL basically. And so this first read-only shows it. The second one is using, so I'm saying the full width. Remember, all command inputs support that. So I'm saying you use the full width of the dialog, and then I'm actually using HTML to center that in the dialog. And so here's some examples of those. So that first one, you see I'm just bolding notice and then using this A-link to provide a reference to this URL. And the second one, I'm using a div with an aligned center to center the text. And this bottom one, just changing the font color. So some basic HTML. So you're not going to be using CSS, and just some basic formatting of text. All right, so that's to get text. Now to get numbers from the user, you can use a value command input. And this is used to get any kind of numeric input from the user. And when you create these, so in this sample dialog here, so there's 6 different command inputs. And when you create one, you have to specify what unit type that value is going to be. Right, so I think in this one, I specified in the command I specified that the unit type for the top one is whatever the current units are for the document. So that would be probably the most common thing you would do, and I'll demonstrate this in just a second. And and the document happened to be in inches when I ran this to build this sample dialog. And so it's displaying the value. So when I create one of these, I specify what the units are and what the initial value is. And so I've specified 2 of whatever the current units are. And down here, I think I specified 2 of internal units, so 2 centimeters, and then that got converted into the current unit, into inches. And this one, I specified that I want this to be displayed in centimeters, and I think I told it the initial value was pi. And then unitless, so I don't see any units on that one. Here I specified even that the units would be an area, so inch times inch. So you can kind of create your own units by combining the existing simple units. And then this bottom one is an angle. And so what I get with this is Fusion is using the preferences that the user has set to say how many decimals do I want to have displayed for this type, and then it's automatically appending these unit types at the end of the strings. And Fusion is validating the input. So if I type something in there that like on the top one, I specified the inch is the unit type, but that's a distance unit. So if I type in something that can't be evaluated as a distance, so if I for example, if I did 5 degrees in that top one, that Fusion would catch that, and it would change the text to red, and this wouldn't be valid. The OK button would be disabled, and Fusion does all that automatically for you. And the input that the user types in here can include equations, so they could do something simple like this would be valid. They can use functions, and there's in the Fusion help, if you look for there's a topic that describes the functions you can use when creating parameters. You can do the same things here. So you could actually type in a function here, and as long as it evaluates to the unit type that you've said, so if it evaluates to any valid distance or a valid angle, whatever the unit type is for that particular input, then that will be okay. You can use names of parameters in these. So I could do something like this and get back a length, assuming D3 is for a length. And then so the user is just entering stuff in there. Fusion's doing all this evaluation, and you're totally out of it. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. You don't have to evaluate it. And at the end, when you do need to get the value, you can get the value either as a real double value, and which is always in database units. And so what that means, so in Fusion, lengths internally are always centimeters. No exceptions to that. It's always centimeters. And angles are always radians. So those are the two that you're mostly going to use. So angles are centimeters and radians. So any of these, if I ask for the value of it, it's going to be returned in, well, the top three would be returned in centimeters. The unitless one will I'll just get that value, so I would get 5 in this case because there is no conversion. The area I would get back in square centimeters, and the angle I would get back in radians. So I can get back the real value, or I can get back the string, just exactly what I see in the dialog that the user has entered. And then I would take that and do whatever with it. And then also with these value command inputs, the user has this option. There's a little drop down next to each one, and it shows the previous values that he's entered, and so he can pick from this list, or he can click measure and then go into the UI and actually do a measure to provide the input. And so you get that for free too. So you don't have to do any coding. It's just you create a value command input and you get all this behavior for free from it. And so here's looking at the code a little bit more for this. So I'm creating, and this is something we haven't touched on too much. This is a little bit confusing, is what I need, how I need to supply the initial value for this is by using a value input object. And the value input object doesn't really represent anything inside Fusion. It's just, it's an API only convenience thing. And it's an object that wraps either a string or a floating point number. And because there are several cases where you can provide either a string or a number. And so for that argument, we take in one of these value input objects. And so in this case, I'm creating a value input, and I'm creating it using this create by string. So I'm creating a value input object that contains a string, and that string is just the number 2. And so now I'm creating using this add value input to actually create the value input for my command. So this first argument is the name of that input, which I'll use later when I want to go find it again to get its value. So it's just whatever name you want to supply. It just needs to be unique amongst the command inputs for your command. The second argument is the name of the command, this command input. So the first one's the ID, the second one's the name, but that's what displays in the dialog, so you can see it in that example by string. The third argument is the units of this input, and so there's a units of measure object that I got from the design, and there's a property on it called default length units, and so I'm using that. So it's whatever the user has said he wants to use as his default units. And let me show you what I mean by that. If I can find Fusion here. Here we go. So right here, so here's my units or millimeters, and I can click and change that to whatever I want. So I'll change it to inch. So now my default units are inches. So that's what that's talking about. So this is getting whatever the current default units are. So before, when I got it, it would have returned millimeters. Now it's returning inches. And so this would be very typical of what you'd want to do, because you want to work in the units that the user said he wants to work in. And then value, so that's the default value. So here I'm passing in the string 2. So I didn't put any units on there. I could have said 2 space IN or 2 space CM, but I didn't specify any units, so it's going to default to the whatever units I specified here. So the default length units in this case. So it's going to default to 2 of whatever the current units are that the user has. So here's this next one. In this case, I'm saying create by real, so it's creating a floating point 2, not a string 2, a floating point 2. And so the same thing, creating this using the default length units, and then provide the value. And so now whenever I use a floating point number, that's going to be in database units. So this is 2 centimeters, but then it's displaying it using the current length units, which are inches. So it converted 2 centimeters to inches, and that's what I see. So where that would be commonly used is if you've calculated some value, right? So and now you want to display that in the dialog, and so now it'll take that value, which if it's length should be in centimeters. So you calculated it in centimeters, and you provide that, and now it displays it to the user in whatever units he's chosen to work in. Right, so that's something I probably should spend a little more time on Thursday, but in units is you should always inside your code really work in centimeters, and then just let Fusion handle the conversion in the dialogs automatically. So you supply centimeters, and then it converts it to whatever the user wants. And then when the user types in stuff, you can always get it back in centimeters. And so here's an angle one. So here I've done a create by real where I'm getting half of pi. And remember, angles are always in radians. And so here we're creating a new value input, and its unit type is degrees, and provide that value. And now it's converted that into degrees. because the user doesn't really even have a choice of how he wants to display degrees in Fusion right now. So it's always going to display it, or how it's going to display angles. It's always going to be in degrees. But internally, angles are always defined in radians. And you can also create value inputs that are unitless. And so it's just going to get some number. And that for the unitless values, it's an empty string. So we're not defining a unit, so that's interpreted as a unitless number. And then here's how it created the area one. Right. So I'm creating it by real. So remember, that's going to be in centimeters. So in this case, since it's an area, it's 45 square centimeters. And then the unit type is inch times inch. And then it converts it to inches, and that's what's displayed. All right, so another type of input is a selection input. So when you want the user to select some kind of entity, and you can use it. So here's an example of where Fusion uses it a lot, right? But picking the two components to use for a joint. And so you can pick one or more entities, and when you create the input, by default it's set up to select any number of entities, but you can limit the number that can be selected. And probably what's more common is you might have just one, so that would be the max that could be selected, or it's probably any number of entities. And you can specify the type of entity that's valid. And so I could say, okay, I only want to be able to select edges. And in some cases, there's even more finer grain types that you can say. So I specify I only want to pick linear edges or circular edges, or I only want to I can pick any face or maybe just planar faces. So you can set up the filtering for that just in the command input itself. And those are defined as a string, and we need to clean this up some in the documentation. It's not clear right now, but there's on the selection command input object itself, there are some strings defined inside it, and so that would be the best way, but it's not obvious right now that they're there. The filters are also listed. There's a topic in the API help called selection filters, and that's probably the best place to go right now to see what filters are supported and what the string is. So filters are defined just using a string. And so like for faces, it would be the string faces. And the selection input supports multiple filters. So I could say, okay, I want to pick planar faces and construction planes. And so that you could do something like that. And then you can also dynamically control the filtering on a selection by using the selection event of a command. And so how this works is you say that you want to hook up to the selection event, so you implement the selection event. And now when your command is running, and whenever the user moves over any entity that is valid for selection that you set up, so let's say I set it up so I could pick faces and planar faces. And so as the user moves over the model, he sees all planar faces highlight under the cursor as the cursor moves over it. And then he can choose to select it by clicking it. So there's kind of that pre-highlight to show that it's valid for selection, and then he can select it. And as if I set it so I only want to pick planar faces, as I move the mouse over the model, so I'm only seeing planar faces do that pre-highlight, and then I can select any planar face. But now if I listen to that selection event, I can do even finer grain filtering. And so let's say that I want to let the user pick a face, and then any faces that he picks after that, have to be parallel to that first face. So he picks the first face, and then I'm listening to that selection event. And so now as the cursor is moving over the model, when it moves over another planar face, before it does the pre-highlight to the user, it fires this selection event. And then I get back the entity that's under the cursor, and then I can look at it and do some analysis to decide if I really want the user to be able to pick that. So I check to see if it's parallel to the first face, and if it is, then I say, yeah, that's okay. And now it does the pre-highlight, and so now the user has the option of selecting it. But I could say, no, it's not parallel to the other one, so no, it's not valid for selection, and then it won't even pre-highlight. So the user never gets a chance to select it. Right? So I can, using this, I can really completely control what the user can select or not. All right, so that's selection inputs. There's drop-down command inputs, and so these just provide a list of options to the user. And so I've got this example in the upper right of this one that I created with the UI, and then some other examples of where Fusion actually uses the same thing. And so this one is very commonly used, probably the most used inside Fusion, I think, is this labeled icon. So it's just a string and also an icon with each item in the dropdown. And so the user can pick which option he wants from that list. And then whichever he picks becomes the one that's displayed at the top level in the dialog. There's also a combo box. So that's just a label without an icon, and then you just get the little radio button next to whatever is currently selected. And when you pick it, that value also is what shows up at the top level. There's a checkbox, and I couldn't find a place actually where Fusion uses this. It probably does somewhere, but I couldn't find it. And in this case, when I click it, it brings up this list of checkboxes, and I can check and uncheck multiple boxes and then go back to the dialog, and then it'll collapse up. So this, it doesn't show the current value because I can have multiples selected. Right, so those are different drop-down types. And then this last one is a text list. So this is just a list of text items, and you pick one, and then that shows it at the top level, and you can see where it's using Fusion there for to pick a font. Right, so those are all supported through the API. This radio button list, which is a little goofy. So it's similar to the drop-down with radio buttons, except it's always showing all of the options instead of having it in a drop-down. But it displays, I think, a little funny, but maybe we'll change that. I don't know. But so anyway, so that's available. And then we call it these Boolean command inputs. And so there's a few different options with this one. They have buttons that have a pressed or unpressed state, so that it's a toggle. So if I click it, it presses. Click it again, it unpresses. And so Fusion uses that. You can see down here to flip a direction. And so you can create those. You have a button that doesn't change state, it just gets clicked. So it's just saying do something right now. So it's not a state change, but an action. So you can have those, and then also the final type, which is basically like the first one, where it's a button that's pressed or unpressed, but instead of having a button, it's just a checkbox. You can create rows of buttons, and there's two flavors of this. Is you can have a single row, or a single button in the row can be selected. So it kind of has a combo box behavior that only one item can be picked. And so that's shown in well, Fusion uses it, for example, in the selection filter. So you pick one of these ways to do the selection in the measure command. And then the other one is multiple buttons can be picked at once. and so it uses that in the text style. So I can say bold and underline together, and I could add italics too. So any of the buttons can be picked, and multiples can be picked at once. There's slider command inputs that you can use. So there's two flavors of these, basically, with lots of options on each one, but a floating point or integers. And you can show the current value, which is shown in that first one, the float slider 1. So that's showing me the current value of the slider, or I could just show labels where I have low and high. And you can have one or two sliders, so those first two have a single slider. The third one, so I can define a low value and a high value, basically. So there's two sliders on that one bar. And there's an option with any of these is you can define a list of valid values. And so the slider would jump to those values that you've set or can be selected. So you can use it in that way too. And here's just an example of a place where Fusion uses it to set the opacity. So it just goes from, I think, 0 to 100, and the user can scroll along. All right, there's spinner command inputs. So this is somewhat similar to the value input that we saw earlier. Remember where we had to specify the unit type. And but this one, so the user can type in a value. I think I didn't try this, but I think it can have all the formulas and all that kind of stuff too. And there's float types, and here there's integer types. So that value input we looked at before is always a floating type. There isn't an integer specific one for it. But here there's floating point or integer, and with integer you don't specify a unit type. It's just a number. But the difference with these is I have these little arrows on the right, and I can click those to increment or decrement the value by some predefined number that you specify when you create the command input. And so here's where Fusion uses it. CAM uses it a lot on all of its different settings. So it's just kind of a different way to get values. If you think that that little spinner option adds value to what you're doing. And these, like the value input, are validated by Fusion. So if the user types in some garbage, then it's going to invalidate it. There's an image command input, which is basically just what you would think. It displays an image in the dialog. And here I'm just showing it where I've said is full width is false in the top one and true in the bottom one, so I just don't see the text. But the image is displayed at its true size, and it doesn't scale, so it's not going to fill the whole width. And then, so those are really all of the different types of inputs that we support right now. And then there's some ways to kind of organize your dialog. So you can create tabs. And so that this first dialog is one I created with the API. So I've got two tabs. You can have an icon associated with each tab. That's optional. It could just be text. And then each tab owns a set of command inputs. Right? So you create a tab, and then you would create command inputs under it. And then you create another tab, create command inputs under it. And then that controls what's under each tab. And then here's an example of just where these tabs are used inside Fusion, inside CAM. And you can also create groups. You can use these together, which CAM is doing. So they've got tabs, and then they have groups within that tab. And so groups are obvious, just a way to group inputs within that single visible pane or tab of the dialog. And it's the same way as tabs. You would create a group, and then you would create command inputs within that group. And then that's how you define the layout of the dialog using groups and tabs. Commands and transactions. So anything you draw in the execute event is transacted. So that means everything that happens in that shows up as a single undo, and you can undo it. And you can see here, this is one of my custom commands, and so it was called cutout shapes, and so it shows up with its icon in the undo command, and I can undo that. So I get that for free. So just anything I do in the execute is in what's called a single transaction, and transactions are what you're undoing, and so I get that undo behavior for free. But anything that I draw in that execute preview internally, I think it's transacted, but it's always aborted, so it never lives beyond the lifetime of a command. And so when I was debugging, when I was first writing some commands, I was doing stuff in the execute preview, and then I would stop the command and want to go look at the results, and then it wasn't there. It was just all this geometry I was building was just disappearing. But it's because when the command terminates for whatever reason, it was successfully executed or it was just stopped by the user, they said cancel, whatever I do in the execute preview is aborted and gone. So it never lives beyond the lifetime of the command. And so just something to be aware of. If you want to look at that preview stuff, you really can't, other than just look at it. You can't have it survive beyond the command to do measures or something like that. Okay. But the stuff that's created in execute does live beyond, but it's all encapsulated in a single transaction. And so we haven't exposed in the API transactions as a concept yet, but you just get them for free by using a command. And so today, since transactions aren't exposed by themselves, you can use a command as a workaround to group a bunch of stuff you've done into a single transaction. And let me demonstrate what I mean here. I've written a little script. And I'll just run it. So this is a script. It's not an add-in. Right? And so a script, remember the big difference between a script is a script, it runs and it's done. And I run it from the script and add-in dialog. So I'll run this, and what it does is it draws 100 lines. Creates a new sketch and draws 100 lines. And so that's not a problem. I could write a script to do that, but now when the script executes and I'm done, there's 100 undos on the stack, one for each line. So every API call has a separate transaction. And I don't really want that. I want the user to be able to kind of get rid of that in one chunk. And so here I have undo transaction samples. So the way I did that is in this, in fact, let me bring it up. So commands, this brings up another point too, is commands can be used, they're not limited to add-ins, they can be used in scripts too. So you could have a script that displays a dialog, gets all the input, and then creates the result. So the difference is it doesn't create a control to execute that command. So there's not a button in the UI for a script. So let me show this. It'll help, I think, illustrate. All right, so this is a little more complicated than it would be nice, but it's not horrible. So this is all of the program. So it's just a little more than a page of this size of text. But so in the run, so my script is getting executed, and it creates a command definition. But this command definition is never going to exist in the UI. The user will never see it. But I'm creating a command definition. I'm hooking up to the command created event, and then I execute the command right here. So I've created this command, and now I execute it. And then this next one, this next statement is Fusion by default for a script. Like I say, it runs and it's done. So once it finishes this run statement, then Fusion kills it. It's done. But in this case, I don't want it to die yet because it's still got some work to do. So I set this auto terminate to false. So Fusion will let the script continue to run. Right. So I call the execute, and when I execute a command, then this command created event gets fired. So I'm listening to that. Remember, I hooked up to that here, the command created event. So now I get that event, and here I hook up to the command execute event. So the execute event is fired at the end of the command, well, when the user usually clicks OK on the dialog, the command execute event is fired. But in this case, I'm not creating a dialog. Well, I'm not building any inputs. So if I don't create any inputs, then the dialog isn't displayed, and it's assumed that you want to execute. So the command created event is fired, a command is created, and all I do on that command is I just hook up to the execute, and then we exit this function, and because no command inputs have been created, then the command execute event is fired, and now I do whatever that command is supposed to do. And so in this case, I call this function called draw lines, and that does all the work. And because this is within the command execute handler, then all the work that I do here, whatever it is encapsulated in a transaction. And then because I'm in a script, now I tell Fusion, okay, go ahead and kill it. Right? Because before, remember, we set that auto terminate to false so that Fusion wouldn't terminate it, but now I have to tell it when to kill it. So once it finishes the execution, then go ahead and terminate the command. So this is using that command behavior just to wrap this work that the draw lines command does, draw lines function does, to wrap that in a single transaction. And then another thing that's come up a couple of times, this is I think my last slide, so we're almost done, is supporting multiple dialogues within a single command. And so first I want to just touch on a couple other things that are available. So there's a message box that Fusion supports, and it's kind of your basic message box, where you can display whatever text you want. It's unformatted, but you can display text, and then you have some control over which buttons are displayed, and I think if there's a question mark or what the type of message box you want displayed. But anyway, so here's another type of dialog. It's just a simple message box. There's also an input box, and that pops up a little dialog where you can specify the prompt, and then it just has a single input where the user can type in whatever text he wants. So there's no validation done on this, it's just text. And so this isn't, so you're not creating command inputs to go into a dialog. These are self-contained. They have their own dialog, and in this case, this input box has just that single input line. There's also a file dialog, so if you need to prompt the user to pick a file or to save a file, you can use this, and it'll display the standard file dialog, so it'll be appropriate for Windows or for Mac, depending on which system you're on, and then you get back the file name that the user has picked while he was in that dialog. And this isn't a dialog, but just cover it because it kind of fits in with these others, is there's also a simple selection. So instead of having to maybe create a command, you just want a simple script that needs the user to pick one thing. And so you can use this select entity function instead. And so with that, you specify a prompt and a filter, and then the user can pick something, and then you get it back, and then you can do something with it. So you don't have to go through the overhead of having a command. And then what we've just talked about is these command dialogues with all the various inputs. But commands can only have one dialogue. So you define your command you define the contents of your dialogue, and that command created gets displayed. The user clicks OK, it's executed, he clicks cancel, just everything's terminated and nothing happens. Excuse me. But a workaround to this is that one command can execute another command. And so you can basically have, so if you've got a command that wants to show two dialogues, you would really have two commands. You would have to divide it up into two commands where each command shows one of those dialogues. And I have an example. And let's see. So this is an add-in. So let me I don't have it to automatically run on startup. And here it is. I need to have some geometry first. All right, so I've created one command, and this first command is the one that shows up that I reference when I create the control. And so it has the icon and and the text, and so that's what we're seeing here. And so I run that, so the command created event got run for that command, and it just is displaying a text box. So it's displaying some information and asking me if I want to continue. So executing this will result in some geometry being created. Do I want to continue? So this is just a standard command dialog, but it just has a single text box command input. And I've said that I want it to fill the width, so I don't see the little label for it. So I'm just seeing a text box. And remember, that's the one that supports some HTML. So here I have a link, and I've changed the controls. Instead of saying OK, cancel, they now say yes and no. So this is just a standard command dialog. And now if I click yes, then the execute for this command is going to happen. So this is the OK or execute. If I click no, nothing happens. It just aborted, it quits. But if I click yes, then in the execute of this command, I execute another command, and we can look at the source for this in just a second. And so now that other command is running, and so now it's going to prompt me for whatever other additional information, and then this just calls the same draw lines. So let's look at that source real quick here. All right, so here's the run, and so I'm creating these two command definitions. And so this is the one that gets displayed, so build part. The second one, the user never sees, so I don't have an icon associated with it. This text doesn't even need to exist, the build part. The user won't see that. And then I add a button to the panel using the first one. And I hook up to the command created event for both of them. So here, the command just got executed. I build up my dialog, I change it to yes, no, and I hook up to the command executed event. I create my text box input, and so now that first dialog displays. And I click OK or yes on it. So now the command executed event for the first one got run or is fired. And then in here, I get the command definition for the other command and I execute it. So now that second command runs. So it's going to get the command created for the second one. I create whatever input, in this case just a selection, and I want to pick planar faces and construction planes. So I set that up. The dialog displays. The user clicks OK, then the execute fires. I get the entity that's been picked, and I call the draw lines with the selected plane. So one command can call another. So that's kind of the workaround, or the way if you need to have multiple inputs for a command, is you really have, or multiple dialogues, you really have multiple commands, one command calling another command. So not super easy, but it works, and so it is an option. All right, so just to finish up a review here, so we're on the 13th, and so that was this review of commands, going into a little more detail. And so on the 15th, this Thursday, thought I would just cover some odds and ends, some questions that have come up, or some kind of tips that I've found as I've been working with the API. And we've changed the schedule. I didn't update this slide, but we're going to move this submitting your app to the App Store up to the 20th, and then we'll see after that. So. All right, so we can go ahead and take some questions. Get that back up.
We do have a question on sent by John Larry. I think he sent an email.
And let me go back. I've been ignoring my email the last little bit, trying to finish up some of this. Or, well, some of it I intended to answer here. I just can't remember specifically John's email, so I'm looking back here.
John, do you want to ask the question directly? I have unmuted you.
And I'm reading your email right now, John. I did look at it before, and then didn't have time to dig into it yet. But my guess on this one is that issue I brought up before is you're changing. I think you're changing. So John has this big dialogue where he's setting some things in the dialogue, and then that gets changed inside Fusion. So it's changing the visibility of some things based on buttons that get clicked in the dialogue. And so that preview that you're showing when the dialogue is up, so that's happening in reaction to input changed or something like that. So all that's being transacted and aborted when the command's done. So you have to do everything that the command's going to do, you have to do in the execute event for it to stick. Otherwise, anything you do anyplace else is going to be aborted. And then it's only what happens in execute that sticks. So I'm guessing that's what the problem is here. So you're making changes while a dialog's up, but that's not happening in the execute. So Fusion aborts all of that work that you've done, and so that's why you're not seeing any results at the end.
Okay, I understand that I have to do an execute, but I think that if I pick on that icon, I can see the results immediately without to go out of the dialog box.
You do see the results, or you don't see the results? Oh,
As you can see in the mail that I saw the results, but immediately it returns to the initial state. So if I want to turn off on the sketch, it turns off the sketch, but when the command finish, it returns to the initial state. So if I want to turn off the sketch, I have to go to OK and out of the dialog box, and then it hide the sketch. I don't want that to do that. I want to hide the sketch immediately when I pick on the icon.
yeah. So when the dialog is still up and you pick on the icon, does the sketch hide right then?
Yeah.
But then when you click OK on the dialog, then it comes back?
No. When I pick on the icon, it turns off, but immediately turn on again. It only works if I pick the icon and click OK. When I click OK, it recognizes that I want to turn off the sketch and turn it off, but only if I click in OK. But if I click on the icon without get out of the dialog box, it don't turn off. Only turn off, but immediately turn off the sketch, turn on.
Yeah, I have to play with that a little bit. I don't have an answer right now. I'd have to experiment.
Okay, I send you my Python file attached to the mail, and explain that in the Word file. If you can see, please, I'd be appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take a look at it today.
Thank you.
And a couple other questions have come in. So there's a question about why we're using pointers instead of dots in the C++ samples, and I don't know the details of why, but you have to. Dots won't work to see the API functions, and I don't know the details of how that's defined, but you just have to use the pointer symbol instead of a dot to access the functions on the API classes. So you'll see that in everything that's using the C++ API. I can find out a little bit more why if you're interested, but the main thing is you just always have to with the API functions. Right, any other questions? So I'm going to figure out somewhere where to post these little samples, and I haven't decided. I think GitHub might be slight overkill for some of these, and so maybe just package them up and put them on the Mod the Machine blog. And so either way, we'll send out an email once we figure that out and once they've been posted and let you know where the code is. So, any more questions? And if not, we'll call it good. So I think that's it. So thank you for attending, and we'll be back Thursday for probably a shorter session, just a few odds and ends. Or if anybody has some specific questions before then, let me know. So, all right, thank you.